$15 million. That is what the United States government placed on a single human head. $15 million for a name, for a location, for coordinates on a mountainside. For 10 years. That number sat on a wanted poster, and nobody collected. Not the DA, not the Mexican army, not the bounty hunters or the informants or the rival cartel commanders who would have given anything to see this particular man in the ground. For a decade, the machine could not find him, and yet he was always there, in the mountains of Jalisco, watching the machine from the dark. These are the stories the authorities couldn't put in a file. Subscribe now, because this one is closing a chapter that has been written in blood for 15 years. The file on Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes is now officially closed by the Mexican government, but the war that follows his name is not. Picture the mountain town of Tapalpa, Jalisco. Most people outside Mexico have never heard of it. It sits roughly 90 kilometers south of Guadalajara, quiet and remote, at an elevation where the air is thin and the roads narrow to one lane as they wind through pine forests and ravines. It is the kind of geography that has historically protected men who do not want to be found. Steep terrain, limited entry points, a community that understands what it means to be watched and what it costs to talk. This was the place he chose. This was the place he was found. It is 3 in the morning on February 22nd, 2026. The town is asleep. Then the sound starts. Helicopters. Multiple. Moving low and fast over the ridgeline, cutting toward a high-security ranch that local residents had always understood was not a place you approached without an invitation, and not a place you looked at directly when you passed. The Mexican army is moving. Special forces from multiple federal branches, backed by the National Guard, coordinated with the Mexican Air Force. And behind all of it, providing the intelligence layer that made this morning possible, the United States government through a joint task force that has been operational since January of this year, running out of U.S. Northern Command, embedding American intelligence assets alongside Mexican military planners. The objective was to arrest him. That detail matters. The operation was designed for a capture, not an execution. 2 helicopters, trained soldiers, rules of engagement designed for a living prisoner being transported to a medical facility in Mexico City and then, almost certainly, eventually, to a cell in the United States. That was the plan. The ranch had other plans. CJNG gunmen opened fire before the boots hit the ground. The weapons recovered at the scene after the firefight ended tell you what kind of resistance this was. Rocket launchers capable of shooting down aircraft and destroying armored vehicles. Not handguns. Not rifles. Anti-aircraft rocket launchers. These were men who had anticipated helicopters and prepared accordingly. The exchange of gunfire was not a brief skirmish. It was a sustained engagement in the dark, in the mountains, against a cartel force that had drilled for exactly this scenario. 4 cartel members were killed at the scene. 3 more, including the man they were all there for, were critically wounded. 3 members of the Mexican armed forces were also wounded in the firefight. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes did not die in Tapalpa. He was loaded onto an aircraft, wounded, and transported toward Mexico City. He died en route. At 30,000 feet over the landscape he had controlled for a decade and a half, the most wanted man in North America was gone. Mexico's Defense Department confirmed it in an official statement. U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landor confirmed it publicly within hours, calling Oseguera one of the bloodiest and most ruthless drug kingpins in the world. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed that the United States had provided intelligence support for the operation. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum urged the country to remain calm. Jalisco Governor Pablo Lemus activated Code Red. And then, within 60 minutes of that news reaching the street, Mexico started to burn. Understand what happened next, because this is the part of the story that the travel advisories and the airline cancellation notices do not fully explain. What happened was not a spontaneous eruption of grief or rage. What happened was coordinated. CJNG activated its contingency across the country in under an hour. That kind of response does not happen without pre-positioned forces, pre-distributed orders, and a command structure that had already prepared for the scenario of losing its leader. The cartel had a plan for this day. They executed it before the body was cold. Armored trucks, the monstruos, the heavy customized vehicles that CJNG had spent years welding into mobile weapons platforms, rolled out into the streets of Jalisco and beyond. Roads across nearly 20 states were blocked. Vehicles torched. Buses set on fire in Guadalajara, in Puerto Vallarta, in Colima, in Michoacan, in Guanajuato, in Nayarit, in Tamaulipas. Reports came in of Costco facilities and pharmacies being torched in retaliation. A gas station in Guadalajara captured on video by a local journalist as CJNG members lit it while people fled. In other neighborhoods, men on motorcycles moved through streets with weapons, blocking intersections, forcing residents to stay inside. In one neighborhood in Puerto Vallarta, a witness traveling to the international airport passed what he described as execution-style killings on the side of the road. Guadalajara, a city of 5 million people and one of the designated host cities for the 2026 FIFA World Cup, became a ghost town by nightfall on February 22nd. Public transportation was suspended across the state of Jalisco. Jalisco Governor Pablo Lemus issued an order for residents to remain in their homes. The U.S. Embassy in Mexico issued a shelter-in-place advisory covering Jalisco, Tamaulipas, Michoacan, Guerrero, and Nueva Leon, urging American nationals to seek shelter and remain in residences or hotels until further notice. Delta, Alaska, American, Air Canada, United, and Aeromexico canceled flights into both Guadalajara and Puerto Vallarta. Guadalajara International Airport footage circulated on social media showing travelers sprinting through the terminal and people taking cover near jetways as smoke rose in the distance over the city. Guatemala reinforced security along its border with Mexico in anticipation of spillover. Schools across multiple states were canceled on Monday morning. Authorities in Jalisco, Michoacan, and Guanajuato reported at least 14 additional people killed on Sunday, including 7 National Guard troops. One woman named Mencho, caught at the Guadalajara airport, told journalists she was alone, scrolling through news on her phone, too frightened to take a taxi. She said, "My plan is to see if there are any taxis, but I'm scared of everything. Blockades, curfews, something happening to me. I'm all alone." That is who gets caught in the crossfire when one man falls. Not soldiers, not cartel commanders. A woman alone at an airport, trying to get home. Now understand how the man who produced that scene came to exist. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was born in July 1966 in Aguililla, a rural township in the western state of Michoacan. This is important geography. Aguililla sits in the heart of the Tierra Caliente region, a mountainous interior zone that has produced generations of men who moved drugs because there was almost nothing else in the economy that paid. Marijuana cultivation was woven into the local agricultural fabric long before he was born. He did not invent the environment. He was shaped by it, and he eventually mastered it and then exported it to the entire country. As a young man, he migrated to the United States. He was arrested on drug charges. He was convicted in California in 1994 for conspiracy to distribute heroin and served 3 years in a federal prison. He was deported back to Mexico. He returned to the United States illegally. He was arrested again. He was deported a second time. What happened next is a detail that intelligence analysts have spent years trying to fully understand. He came back to Mexico and became a local police officer in Jalisco. This is not a small detail. A man who had been convicted of drug trafficking in the United States, who had done federal time, who had been deported twice, was working as a police officer in the very state where he would later build the most powerful cartel in the country. That position gave him something more valuable than a salary. It gave him an education in how law enforcement operated, how surveillance was conducted, how informants were identified, how operations were planned, and more importantly, where the vulnerabilities in all of those systems were located. Every tactical choice he made over the following 2 decades reflected that training. He understood the playbook because he had once held a copy of it himself. He left law enforcement and joined the Mencho Cartel, initially serving as an enforcer, then rising to head of hitmen, Chief of Operational Security and Violence. When the Mencho Cartel began to fracture around 2009 and 2010, he did not wait to see which faction survived. He consolidated loyal cells around himself, declared war on rivals, and formalized a new organization. CJNG, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion, was operational by approximately 2009 to 2011, depending on which intelligence assessment you consult. Early enemies included the Zetas and the Knights Templar. Former allies in Sinaloa became targets. Within 3 years, CJNG had established itself as the fastest-growing criminal organization in Mexico. Within 5, the DEA had placed it on equal footing with the Sinaloa cartel in terms of reach, resources, and threat level. By 2019, DEA assessments indicated that CJNG was responsible for at least one-third of all drugs entering the United States by ANC. The organization was present in all 50 U.S. states. It had contacts in more than 40 countries, including throughout Latin America, Australia, China, and Southeast Asia. The cartel's infrastructure included links to chemical precursor suppliers in China and control over key seaports for importing those chemicals into Mexico for conversion into synthetic drugs. The product of that infrastructure was fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, and heroin flowing into American cities at a volume that is difficult to fully conceptualize. The DEA called it a $20 billion empire, structured not like a traditional cartel hierarchy but like a franchise business, approximately 90 semi-autonomous organizations operating under the CJNG umbrella, each with regional sovereignty but each feeding up through a command structure that answered ultimately to him. That franchise model was deliberate. It made the organization resilient to the kind of targeted strikes that had decapitated previous cartels. You could arrest a regional boss and the franchise continued operating. You could seize a shipment and another route was already active. Former DEA official Paul Crane once described Oseguera as public enemy number 1 and said he commanded an army of thousands. That army was not organized as a single force that could be defeated in a single battle. It was distributed, redundant, and specifically designed to outlive the man at the top of it. The tactics he pioneered transformed cartel warfare across Mexico and created doctrine that rival organizations studied and adopted. CJNG was the first cartel to weaponize consumer drones at scale, attaching improvised explosive devices to commercially available drone platforms and deploying them against rival forces and military units. This is not a metaphor. This is a battlefield innovation that security researchers began tracking in Mexican cartel conflicts years before drone warfare became a mainstream geopolitical conversation. CJNG trained operators. CJNG had maintenance protocols. CJNG shared this knowledge with allied cells. Reports emerged in the months before his death suggesting that CJNG members had even received training in drone combat operations from individuals connected to the conflict in Ukraine. The organization was not static. It learned. It adapted. It imported military innovations from active war zones and applied them to the terrain at Jalisco and Michoacan. The armored monster vehicles followed the same logic. Commercial trucks modified with steel plating, welded gun mounts, and in some cases, vehicle-mounted heavy weapons. Not improvised. Engineered. These were not the vehicles of a desperate organization. They were the vehicles of a force that had concluded it could meet the Mexican military with comparable firepower and that the political cost of doing so was acceptable. In June 2020, CJNG demonstrated exactly how far they were willing to take that logic. A convoy of cartel vehicles intercepted Omar Garcia Harfuch, then the head of Mexico City's police force, in an armored SUV in the heart of the capital. They used grenades and high-powered rifles in broad daylight in a neighborhood with civilian bystanders present. Garcia Harfuch was shot 3 times. He survived. He is now Mexico's Secretary of Security and Civilian Protection. He was part of the planning apparatus for the operation in Tapalpa. He was in the room where the decision was made to send the helicopters into those mountains on February 22nd. That thread of personal history runs straight from 2020 to 2026. The political pressure that produced Sunday's operation had been building for more than a year. When Donald Trump returned to the presidency in January 2025, the cartel question moved to the center of U.S.-Mexico relations. Trump designated CJNG and 7 other cartels as foreign terrorist organizations in February 2025. That designation was not symbolic. It expanded the legal toolkit, unlocked new asset-freezing mechanisms, intensified intelligence sharing obligations, and created diplomatic pressure on Mexico City to produce results. President Claudia Sheinbaum had already been moving in a more aggressive direction than her predecessor, deploying the military in a more confrontational posture against criminal organizations. The Joint Interagency Task Force Counter-Cartel, established in January 2026 and operating through U.S. Northern Command, formalized the intelligence coordination that made Sunday's operation possible. American officials were careful to describe it as a Mexican military operation. The intelligence that located him was joint. The success, as they said publicly, was Mexico's. Federal prosecutors in the United States had indicted Oseguera multiple times since 2017. The most recent superseding indictment, filed in April 2022, charged him with conspiracy to manufacture and distribute methamphetamine, cocaine, and fentanyl for importation into the United States, and with use of firearms during drug trafficking. In December 2024, the State Department raised the reward for information leading to his arrest or conviction to $15 million, the highest bounty ever placed on a Mexican drug trafficker. Less than 15 months later, that file closed without the reward ever being paid. Now comes a question that every intelligence analyst in Washington and Mexico City is working through this week. The succession problem inside CJNG is not a simple one. Unlike the Sinaloa Cartel, where the capture and extradition of El Chapo allowed his sons, the Chapitos, to assume command with relative speed and a degree of recognized internal legitimacy, CJNG has no clear heir. The family succession path has been almost entirely blocked by law enforcement on both sides of the border. His son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, once served as second-in-command of the entire organization. He was extradited to the United States in 2020 and convicted in September 2024 on drug trafficking and firearms charges. He was sentenced to life in prison in March 2025. He will not be running anything from his current location. His daughter, Jessica Johanna Oseguera Gonzalez, known as La Negra, managed a significant portion of the cartel's legitimate business fronts. She was arrested in the United States in 2020, and though she served a reduced sentence and was released in 2022, her profile and criminal record in both countries limit any open leadership role. His wife, Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, whose family through the Los Quinas network managed the financial architecture of the cartel for years, was herself imprisoned in Mexico and only released in February 2025. The organized financial family network that once provided the cartel's money laundering infrastructure was largely dismantled following a series of U.S. indictments beginning in 2015. What remains is a contest among regional commanders who each built independent power bases under the CJNG umbrella. El Sapo, Hugo Gonzalo Mendoza Gaitan, is a name Mexican federal prosecutors of the Attorney General's office have placed with greatest emphasis in their internal succession assessments. He is identified as the boss of the Puerto Vallarta Plaza, a strategic coastal position controlling maritime trafficking routes. According to U.S. Treasury Department designations, he is a senior CJNG member specialized in recruitment strategies. Mexican intelligence confirms that the 4 CJNG members arrested in Jalisco and Nayarit just 5 weeks before Sunday's operation were confirmed to be operating under his direct orders, suggesting active operational command authority. Crucially, Mexican authorities report that he carries explicit endorsement from members of the Oseguera family for the leadership role, giving him an internal legitimacy that goes beyond territorial control alone. The U.S. State Department has placed a $5 million bounty on his head. El Jardinero, Ortiz Flores Silva, represents a different kind of candidate. Originally from Huetamo, Mycocan, he rose from a security role within the CJNG leadership structure to become what security analysts call the organization's logistical brain. He controls key corridors in Jalisco, Mycocan, Nayarit, and has supervised the cartel's expansion in Zacatecas, one of the most violently contested territories in the country over the past 3 years. His specialty is the operational protection of the cartel production infrastructure, the fentanyl and methamphetamine laboratories that generate the organization's core revenue. He is vital to the economics of the organization in a way that most military commanders are not. Security analyst Victor Sanchez has described him as the most powerful CJNG figure who is neither a member of the Oseguera family nor the Valencia family, which makes him a potential unifying figure capable of holding alliances across factional lines. His limitation is the same thing that makes him effective. He is an administrator, not a charismatic leader. The U.S. State Department also carries a $5 million bounty on his head. There is a third figure that intelligence reports from both countries are increasingly focusing on. Juan Carlos Valencia Gonzalez, known as L03 or LR3, is the son of Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia, which places him inside the family structure without being a blood descendant of the man who just died. His position within the organization connects a logistical Valencian network with the operational CJNG command structure in a way that could theoretically bridge the factions that might otherwise pull apart. He has been linked to strategic drug trafficking operations and control of key plazas. His ability to consolidate quickly will likely depend on whether he can win the loyalty of the military wing before the military wing decides it would rather fragment than follow. Beyond these three, there are additional commanders in the race. Ricardo Ruiz Velasco, known as El Doble A, who controls CJNG's presence in the greater Guadalajara metropolitan area, the historical epicenter of the organization. Julio Alberto Castillo Rodriguez, known as El Chorro, who is a son-in-law of El Mencho and whose power base lies in financial operations at the port of Manzanillo. And Heraclio Guerrero Martinez, known as Tio Laco, a territorial commander with operational roots in Coke and experience in fuel theft networks. The DEA's own structural analysis of CJNG describes it as a franchise of approximately 90 organizations. What that means for the succession question is this. Even if these senior commanders fracture and go to war with each other, the individual franchises do not disappear. They continue operating in their territories. They continue moving product. They continue collecting extortion. They continue recruiting. The human cost of that fragmentation falls not on the cartel's profit margins, but on the civilian populations in the territories where the internal war is fought. If the history of Mexican cartel transitions tells us anything with certainty, it is that the period immediately following a leadership collapse produces more violence, not less, as mid-level commanders test new boundaries and rival organizations move to exploit any perceived weakness. The DEA analyst Eduardo Guerrero, director of Mexican consulting group Lantia Intelligence, put it plainly when he told CNN earlier this year that CJNG's fragmented franchise structure means you would need a more complex and more sophisticated strategy to weaken and dismember the organization. The killing of one man, even the man at the top, is not that strategy. It is the beginning of a new chapter in that strategy. The organization is a living system that was specifically engineered to survive exactly this moment. Guadalajara, remember, hosts 4 matches of the 2026 FIFA World Cup beginning in June. Hundreds of thousands of international visitors are expected. The stadium is already built. The matches are already scheduled. FIFA has not commented publicly on the security situation. As of Monday, the Mexican government has not suggested any changes to the World Cup plans. The violence that erupted Sunday night cleared enough by morning that roadblocks in Jalisco were mostly resolved. But mostly is not a reassuring word when you are a foreign government making travel advisories or an airline scheduling flights into a city that was a ghost town 12 hours ago. And then there is the human accounting beneath all of it. Not the commanders, not the politicians, not the intelligence officials giving press statements. The people who never chose any of this. Mexico's security crisis has killed more than 450,000 people since 2006 when the government's formal war against the cartels began. That is not a number produced by soldiers fighting soldiers. The overwhelming majority of that body count is civilian. Farmers killed because their land sat on trafficking corridor. Journalists killed for reporting what they saw. Local politicians killed for refusing to cooperate. Ordinary people killed in the crossfire of battles they never understood and could not avoid. The fentanyl that CJNG laboratories produced under his watch has killed tens of thousands of Americans annually. Families on both sides of the border who never heard the name Tapalpa and never will. The cartel did not just traffic drugs. It diversified, as any successful criminal enterprise does when it becomes powerful enough to operate freely. Extortion of local businesses, fuel theft from government pipelines, human smuggling, arms trafficking, and the systematic corruption of local government officials. The arrest of Diego Rivera, the mayor of Tequila Municipality, just weeks before Sunday's operation, along with 3 other local officials, over an alleged extortion scheme in collusion with CJNG, is a reminder that the cartel did not exist alongside the institutions of the Mexican state. It operated through them. The corruption problem does not end with a death in a helicopter over Jalisco. This is a landscape that Sunday morning in Tapalpa left behind. A government that needed a win and achieved one. A cartel that lost its leader and responded within the hour with coordinated violence across 20 states. A country navigating a succession crisis inside the most powerful criminal organization in its history, for months before it co-hosts the largest sporting event in the world. 14 people confirmed dead on Sunday alone, 7 of them National Guard troops. Schools cancelled. Flights cancelled. Flights to Puerto Vallarta halted while smoke rose over the beachfront hotels. A woman alone at an airport, too scared to take a taxi home. That is a human footprint of what happened in Tapalpa. The broader question security analysts are now asking is not just who leads CJNG tomorrow. It is whether the rival organizations, the Sinaloa Cartel, already fractured and fighting its own internal war since the capture of Ismael Zambada Garcia, known as El Mayo, in July of last year, along with regional groups like the Viagras and Mycocan and La Familia Michoacana, will move immediately to challenge CJNG in the territories it controls. Every external rival is watching the same information the intelligence community is watching right now. They are calculating whether the moment of transition inside CJNG represents an opportunity. History says many of them will decide it does. History also says a decision produces casualties at a ratio of civilians to combatants that no official statement will ever fully capture. Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes spent 30 years evading capture. He built an organization specifically designed to outlive him, structured as a franchise system of 90 semi-autonomous cells that could continue operating without a central command giving daily instructions. He kept such a low profile that for years, the only known photograph of him was decades old. He moved through the mountains of Jalisco as a ghost, while his organization flooded the streets of American cities with synthetic poison. He was found, finally, in the dark at 3 a.m, in a town 90 kilometers south of the city he had claimed as his base for 15 years. He died in the air over the country he had spent a lifetime exploiting. That organization is now proving, in the most violent terms available to it, that it understood the contingency. It had prepared. The throne is empty. The war for it has already started. The files on El Mencho are closing. The files on what comes next are still blank pages. Stay with Capo Underground Files as we track the fallout in real time. Subscribe now, because the war for his territory is already underway, and the next case file opens before the smoke clears. End of case file number 47.